The snow fell heavy and silent across the Ardennes forest on December 16, 1944, as hundreds of thousands of German soldiers prepared to launch Adolf Hitler's last desperate gamble of World War II. In the pre-dawn darkness, German artillery erupted along an 80-mile front, catching American forces completely by surprise. This was the beginning of what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's final offensive on the Western Front that would culminate in some of the most brutal fighting and heinous war crimes of the entire European theater. What unfolded during those frozen December days would reveal the true barbarism of the Nazi regime, even as the Third Reich crumbled around them. While American soldiers celebrated a makeshift Christmas in the besieged town of Bastogne, surrounded and outnumbered, but refusing to surrender, SS units were systematically executing American prisoners of war and Belgian civilians throughout the Ardennes. These were not random acts of violence born from the chaos of battle. They were deliberate, calculated murders ordered from the highest levels of Nazi command, including Hitler himself. The story begins weeks before the first shot was fired, in the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's Eastern Front headquarters, where the Führer obsessed over maps and weather reports. Hitler believed that one massive blow against the Western Allies could split the British and American forces, recapture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace that would allow Germany to focus entirely on stopping the Soviet advance from the east. It was a fantasy born of desperation, but Hitler convinced himself and his generals that surprise and brutality could achieve what German arms could no longer accomplish through conventional warfare alone. Hitler personally selected the units that would spearhead the assault. Among them was the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, commanded by SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, a hardened veteran of the Eastern Front where the laws of war had long since ceased to exist. Peiper and his men had learned their trade in Russia, where the execution of prisoners and civilians was routine, where entire villages were burned with their inhabitants still inside, where the distinction between soldier and civilian had been deliberately erased by Nazi racial ideology. The orders that filtered down to these SS units in the days before the offensive were explicit and merciless. Hitler had decreed that this battle must be fought with a wave of terror and fright, that no human inhibitions should be shown. The Führer's directive was clear in its brutality. The offensive was to be preceded by a wave of terror that would break the enemy's will to resist. Prisoners were to be shot if they slowed the advance. Civilians who resisted or harbored enemy soldiers were to be executed. Terror was not a byproduct of this offensive. It was a weapon, deliberately wielded. On that foggy morning of December 16th, as German forces smashed into the American lines, catching the inexperienced troops of the 106th Infantry Division completely off guard, the machinery of murder was already in motion. Peiper's Kampfgruppe, a battle group of tanks, armored vehicles, and SS Panzer Grenadiers, raced through the American positions with orders to reach the Meuse River in 4 days. Speed was everything and nothing. Not even the Jena Convention would be allowed to slow them down. The first massacre occurred on December 17th, just 1 day into the offensive, near the crossroads of Bastogne, just outside the Belgian town of Malmedy. Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, a unit of about 140 American soldiers, was traveling in a convoy of trucks and jeeps when they encountered the spearhead of Kampfgruppe Peiper. The Americans, lightly armed and completely surprised, had no chance against the German tanks and armored vehicles, surrendered. What happened next would become the most notorious atrocity committed against American soldiers in the European theater. The prisoners were herded into a field adjacent to the crossroads. They stood there, hands raised, breath visible in the frozen air, believing they would be processed according to the rules of war. Some of the men talked quietly among themselves, reassuring each other that as prisoners, they would be safe. They were wrong. At approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, on direct orders from their SS officers, German soldiers opened fire on the assembled prisoners with machine guns and pistols. The initial volley cut down dozens of men where they stood. Bodies crumpled into the snow, which quickly turned red with blood. Those who survived the first burst of gunfire threw themselves to the ground, desperately trying to play dead as SS troops walked among the bodies, shooting anyone who moved or moaned. Private Homer Ford lay motionless as German soldiers walked past, firing pistol shots into the heads of wounded Americans. He could hear the crunch of boots in the snow, the occasional laugh, the single shots that ended groaning. For 2 hours he lay perfectly still among the corpses of his comrades, his uniform soaking up the blood of the dead soldier beside him. When the Germans finally moved on, Ford and a handful of other survivors waited until dark before crawling away through the frozen fields to reach American lines and report the massacre. The testimonies of survivors paint a picture of calculated brutality. Private Kenneth Ahrens remembered seeing German soldiers laughing as they fired into the mass of prisoners. Another survivor, Private Michael Skoda, described how SS troops systematically walked through the field, kicking bodies to see if anyone was still alive, then shooting them in the head. Some Americans were shot while trying to surrender, their hands still raised when the bullets struck them down. Others were machine-gunned as they tried to flee across the snow-covered fields. 84 American soldiers died in that field outside Malmedy, their bodies left frozen in the snow, a testament to the barbarity of Hitler's direct orders to wage war without mercy. But Malmedy was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of systematic murder that would continue throughout the Battle of the Bulge, reaching its crescendo during the Christmas season when Christian charity and human mercy should have prevailed. As Kampfgruppe Peiper continued its advance, leaving a trail of murdered prisoners and civilians in its wake, the German offensive initially achieved its goal of surprise and panic. American units were overrun, scattered, and in some cases completely destroyed. The German plan called for the rapid capture of key road junctions and bridges, and in the confusion of those first days, it seemed that Hitler's gamble might succeed. The town of Bastogne, a crucial crossroads in the Belgian Ardennes, became the focus of the German assault. 7 major roads converged on this small market town, making it essential for the movement of German armor toward Antwerp. The American High Command recognized its importance and rushed the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, to defend it. These paratroopers, veterans of D-Day and Operation Market Garden, arrived just hours before the German forces surrounded the town. By December 20th, Bastogne was completely encircled. Inside the perimeter, American forces prepared for a siege while German commanders demanded surrender. The situation was desperate. Ammunition was running low, medical supplies were nearly exhausted, and the wounded were dying for lack of proper treatment. The weather was brutal, with temperatures dropping well below freezing and snow falling continuously. Soldiers suffered from frostbite, trench foot, and exposure. Many units were down to their last rations. It was in this context that one of the war's most famous exchanges occurred. On December 22nd, German officers approached American lines under a white flag with a surrender ultimatum. The message was delivered to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne. The German note was formal and threatening, warning of annihilation if the Americans did not surrender. McAuliffe's reply was one word, nuts, which left the German officers confused, until it was explained to them that it was definitely a negative response. While the defenders of Bastogne prepared for the German assault they knew would come, SS units throughout the Ardennes continued their campaign of terror. In the small Belgian village of Stavelot, SS troops executed more than 130 civilians, including women and children, accusing them of aiding American forces. Witnesses described scenes of unimaginable horror as families were dragged from their homes and shot in the streets. Children were killed in front of their parents, and parents in front of their children. The massacre at Stavelot occurred over several days. Beginning on December 18th, SS troops, frustrated by American resistance and partisan activity, turned their rage on the civilian population. They went house to house, breaking down doors, searching for anyone they suspected of helping the Americans. The criteria for execution was arbitrary and brutal. Speaking English, having American cigarettes, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time, was enough to warrant death. Madame Regina Gregoire, one of the few survivors, later testified about the horror she witnessed. SS soldiers burst into the shelter where she and dozens of other civilians had taken refuge. The soldiers separated the men from the women and children, marching the men outside. She heard the machine guns open fire, then individual shots as the Germans finished off the wounded. The women and children were forced to remain in the shelter, listening to the killing, not knowing if they would be next. In the village of Chinon, another massacre unfolded on Christmas Day itself, though this time with a dark twist that showed how brutality breeds brutality. American soldiers of the 11th Armored Division, having heard reports of the Malmedy Massacre and having witnessed the bodies of executed American prisoners, took their revenge on German prisoners. Approximately 60 German soldiers who had surrendered were lined up and machine-gunned in a field outside the village. While this revenge killing was never officially sanctioned, it demonstrated how Hitler's orders for a war without mercy had poisoned both sides, turning the battlefield into a scene of reciprocal atrocity. Meanwhile, in Bastogne, American soldiers attempted to celebrate Christmas under siege. The surrounded paratroopers and support units fashioned makeshift Christmas decorations from ammunition boxes and parachute silk. Some units managed to scrounge together special meals from their meager rations. In cellars and destroyed buildings, small groups of soldiers sang Christmas carols while German shells exploded overhead. Chaplains held services in aid stations filled with wounded men, offering communion with whatever bread and wine they could find. The juxtaposition was stark and terrible. While American soldiers in Bastogne tried to maintain some semblance of humanity and Christmas spirit despite the surrounding horror, SS units continued their murderous rampage through the Ardennes. On Christmas Eve in the village of Bande, SS troops executed 34 Belgian civilians, including several teenagers, accusing them of being partisans. The victims were forced to stand in the ruins of a house destroyed by artillery before being shot with machine guns. Their bodies were left in the rubble as a warning to other civilians. The testimony of survivors from Bande reveals the calculated nature of these killings. The SS troops arrived in the village on Christmas Eve morning, going from house to house, selecting young men seemingly at random. Leon Prile, who was 17 at the time, was dragged from his family's Christmas Eve meal. His mother begged the soldiers to spare him, explaining that he was just a boy who had nothing to do with the resistance. The SS officer responded by striking her with his pistol and dragging Leon away. He was among those executed later that day. These massacres were not the actions of individual soldiers losing control in the heat of battle. They were the direct result of orders from the highest levels of Nazi command. Hitler had explicitly stated that the offensive should be conducted with total ruthlessness. SS commanders like Peiper had been told that speed was more important than adhering to international law. The message was clear that prisoners and civilians were expendable if they interfered with the mission's objectives. The evidence for this systematic approach to murder is overwhelming. Captured German documents revealed orders to shoot prisoners if they could not be quickly evacuated. SS officers later testified at war crimes trials that they had been explicitly told the rules of war did not apply during the Ardennes offensive. Multiple units across different sectors committed similar atrocities, indicating a coordinated policy rather than isolated incidents. On Christmas Day, as American soldiers in Bastogne opened K-ration Christmas dinners that had been airdropped by C-47 transport planes, flying through heavy flak, Joachim Peiper's Kampfgruppe was already in retreat. The offensive had stalled, the promised reinforcements had not materialized, and American resistance had proven stronger than anticipated. But even in retreat, the SS continued their murders. Prisoners were shot rather than released, and civilians suspected of providing information to advancing American forces were executed. The weather finally cleared on December 23rd, allowing Allied aircraft to provide desperately needed support to the defenders of Bastogne. C-47s dropped supplies by parachute while P-47 Thunderbolts strafed and bombed German positions. The sight of the colored parachutes, bringing ammunition, medical supplies, and food, lifted the spirits of the besieged defenders. Some of the parachutes, drifting down through the snow-filled sky, landed on Christmas trees, creating an oddly festive scene in the midst of battle. On December 26, the day after Christmas, elements of General George Patton's Third Army, led by the 4th Armored Division, finally broke through to Bastogne, ending the siege. The relief column had fought through heavy German resistance, suffering significant casualties to reach the surrounded paratroopers. When the lead tanks rolled into Bastogne's perimeter, they were greeted by exhausted but jubilant defenders who had held against overwhelming odds. But the Battle of the Bulge was far from over, and neither were the atrocities. As American forces counterattacked, pushing the Germans back toward their starting positions, they discovered more evidence of SS war crimes. In village after village, they found the bodies of executed civilians and prisoners. The frozen corpses told silent stories of brutality that shocked even battle-hardened veterans who thought they had seen the worst war had to offer. The discovery of these atrocities had an immediate effect on American soldiers. Units that had previously taken prisoners now sometimes refused to do so, particularly when dealing with SS troops. The distinctive SS runes on uniforms and helmets became death warrants. Some American commanders had to explicitly order their men to take SS prisoners, knowing they would be needed for war crimes trials. The cycle of violence that Hitler had initiated with his orders for a war of terror had created a battlefield where mercy was increasingly rare. In the village of Malmedy itself, American troops discovered more bodies of executed civilians. The SS had accused the townspeople of signaling to American aircraft and had executed dozens in reprisal. Among the dead were women and children, their bodies left in the streets as a warning to others. One American soldier wrote in his diary about finding the body of a young girl, no more than 10 years old, shot in the back of the head, still clutching a doll. Such scenes would haunt the liberators for the rest of their lives. The investigation into these war crimes began even before the battle ended. American intelligence officers interviewed survivors, photographed crime scenes, and collected evidence that would later be used in war crimes trials. The testimonies they gathered painted a picture of systematic brutality that went far beyond the violence inherent in warfare. This was murder, plain and simple, conducted on a massive scale and with official sanction. One of the most detailed accounts came from Madame Adèle Baudarwy, a Belgian woman who survived the massacre at Stavelot. She described how SS troops had herded civilians into a building, then set it on fire. Those who tried to escape the flames were shot. She survived by hiding beneath the bodies of others who had been killed, remaining motionless for hours as the Germans searched for survivors. Her testimony would later prove crucial in convicting SS officers of war crimes. The American military's Judge Advocate General's office compiled extensive documentation of the atrocities. They identified specific SS units involved in the killings and traced the chain of command up to senior officers. The evidence was overwhelming, including photographs of crime scenes, autopsies of victims showing they had been shot at close range, often in the back of the head, and multiple eyewitness testimonies that corroborated each other. As the German offensive finally collapsed in January 1945 and Wehrmacht forces retreated back to their starting positions, the full scope of the Christmas massacres became clear. Hundreds of American prisoners and Belgian civilians had been murdered in cold blood. The exact number will never be known, as some bodies were never found, and some massacres likely went unreported. Conservative estimates put the number of murdered prisoners and civilians at over 500, though the actual figure was probably higher. The Battle of the Bulge officially ended on January 25, 1945, with German forces pushed back to their starting lines, The offensive had cost Germany its last reserves of men and equipment, hastening the final collapse of the Third Reich. But the legacy of the Christmas massacres would long outlive the Nazi regime. They served as a stark reminder of what happens when military forces abandon the laws of war and embrace terror as a weapon. The Malmedy Massacre trial, held at Dachau in 1946, saw 73 members of Kampfgruppe Peiper prosecuted for war crimes. Joachim Peiper himself was sentenced to death, though his sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment, and he was released in 1956. Many survivors and families of victims felt that justice was never truly served, that the perpetrators of these Christmas massacres received sentences far too lenient for their crimes. The prosecution presented extensive evidence of premeditated murder. They showed that the SS troops had been specifically ordered to spread terror, that they had been told prisoners would slow their advance, and that they had been assured they would not be held accountable for any actions taken during the offensive. The defense argued that the chaos of battle made it impossible to determine individual responsibility, but the evidence of systematic killing was too strong to ignore. Witness after witness took the stand to describe what they had seen and experienced. American survivors of Malmedy told of lying among the dead for hours, afraid to move as German soldiers walked among the bodies, firing pistol shots into anyone who showed signs of life. Belgian civilians described the horror of watching their neighbors being executed for crimes they had not committed. The accumulation of testimony painted a picture of deliberate, systematic murder that could not be explained away as the inevitable consequence of warfare. The impact of these massacres extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. They fundamentally changed how American soldiers viewed the war against Nazi Germany. If there had been any doubt about the nature of the enemy they were fighting, the Christmas massacres removed it. This was not a conventional military opponent that could be defeated and then reconciled with. This was a regime that had abandoned all pretense of civilized conduct, that had embraced murder as policy. The psychological impact on the survivors was profound and lasting. Many suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, haunted by memories of that frozen field outside Malmedy or the burning buildings of Stavelot. Homer Ford, who had survived Malmedy by playing dead among the corpses, never fully recovered from the experience. He suffered nightmares for the rest of his life, often waking up believing he was back in that field, surrounded by the dead. The Belgian civilians who survived the massacres faced their own trauma. They had to rebuild their communities, while living with the memory of neighbors and family members who had been murdered. In many villages, memorials were erected to commemorate the victims, simple stone monuments that listed names and ages, permanent reminders of the Christmas when terror came to the Ardennes. The Christmas massacres also had a broader impact on the development of international humanitarian law. The shock and revulsion they generated helped build support for strengthening the Geneva Conventions and establishing clear consequences for those who violated the laws of war. The principle that superior orders were not a valid defense for war crimes, established at Nuremberg and reinforced by cases like the Malmedy trial, became a cornerstone of international law. Yet perhaps the most important legacy of the Christmas massacres is the lesson they teach about the fragility of civilization and the ease with which ordinary people can become perpetrators of extraordinary evil. The SS men who committed these murders were not born monsters. They were products of a system that had deliberately dehumanized its enemies, that had taught them to see violence as strength and mercy as weakness. They had been conditioned through years of propaganda and indoctrination to believe that the rules that govern civilized conduct did not apply to them. The contrast between the American soldiers celebrating a makeshift Christmas in besieged Bastogne and the SS troops committing murder throughout the Ardennes could not be starker. It represented two different visions of humanity, two different answers to the question of how people should conduct themselves even in the extreme circumstances of war. The Americans in Bastogne, despite facing death and suffering terrible privations, tried to maintain their humanity, to celebrate Christmas even under siege. The SS, following Hitler's orders for a war of terror, abandoned humanity altogether. The story of Private First Class William Desabry illustrates this contrast. Desabry was defending a position outside Bastogne on Christmas Eve when he was severely wounded by German artillery. As he lay dying in an aid station, he asked the chaplain to write a letter to his family, telling them he was thinking of them on Christmas and that he loved them. At the same moment, just miles away, SS troops were executing civilians in Bande, showing no mercy even on Christmas Eve. The weather during that Christmas of 1944 seemed to reflect the horror unfolding below. The snow that fell continuously turned red with blood in field after field. The frozen ground made it impossible to bury the dead properly, so bodies remained where they fell, preserved by the cold, bearing witness to the brutality that had claimed them. American soldiers advancing through the Ardennes after the German retreat described a landscape of death, where every village seemed to hold new evidence of atrocity. The role of Hitler himself in these massacres cannot be understated. His personal orders for the offensive emphasized the need for ruthlessness and terror. He had told his commanders that this battle would decide the fate of the German people, that conventional military considerations must be set aside in favor of total war. He had created the ideological framework that made these massacres not only possible, but inevitable. The SS troops who pulled the triggers at Malmedy and Stavelot were following a logic that began in Hitler's diseased mind. Hitler's decision to launch the Ardennes offensive, despite the objections of many of his generals who knew Germany no longer had the resources for such an ambitious operation, reflected his increasing detachment from reality. He believed that brutality could substitute for military strength, that terror could achieve what tanks and artillery could not. The Christmas massacres were the logical conclusion of this thinking, the inevitable result of a worldview that saw violence as the solution to every problem. As news of the massacres spread through American forces, it had an unexpected consequence that worked against German interests. Instead of breaking American morale as Hitler had intended, the atrocities stiffened resistance. American soldiers who might have been inclined to surrender when surrounded now fought to the death, knowing what fate might await them as prisoners. The massacre at Malmedy in particular became a rallying cry for American forces, a reminder of why they were fighting and what they were fighting against. The liberation of the concentration camps in 1945 would soon reveal the full extent of Nazi barbarity. But the Christmas massacres of 1944 provided an early glimpse of the systematic nature of Nazi violence. They showed that the Holocaust was not an aberration, separate from the military conduct of the war, but part of a consistent pattern of behavior that characterized the Nazi regime from top to bottom. The investigation and documentation of these crimes also established important precedents for how war crimes should be investigated and prosecuted. The careful collection of evidence, the protection of witnesses, and the methodical building of cases against the perpetrators created a template that would be used in future war crimes investigations. The principle that war crimes must be documented and punished, even in the chaos of ongoing conflict, was firmly established. Some of the most poignant testimonies came from Belgian children who witnessed the massacres. Young Leon Frank, who was 12 years old during the massacre at Stavelot, described seeing his father shot by SS troops who accused him of being a partisan. Leon had hidden in a cellar and watched through a small window as his father was forced to kneel in the snow before being shot in the head. Such testimonies, delivered with the simple directness of children who had seen things no child should see, had a powerful impact on those seeking justice for the victims. The Christmas massacres also revealed the complexity of survival and resistance under extreme circumstances. Some Belgian civilians risked their lives to hide American soldiers or help them escape. Others collaborated with the Germans, either out of fear or ideological sympathy. The massacres often targeted those suspected of helping Americans, but the Germans' criteria for suspicion were so broad that virtually anyone could become a victim. The story of Father Jean-Baptiste, Musty exemplifies this courage. The Belgian priest hid several American soldiers in his church during the German occupation of his village. When SS troops arrived and demanded he reveal the Americans' location, he refused. He was executed on Christmas morning, shot against the first by wall of his own church. His sacrifice saved the lives of the soldiers he had hidden, who later testified about his heroism. As the full story of the Christmas massacres emerged in the months and years after the war, it became clear that they represented something more than isolated war crimes. They were symptoms of a system that had deliberately cultivated cruelty, that had trained its soldiers to see mercy as weakness and brutality as strength. The SS troops who committed these murders had been shaped by years of indoctrination that portrayed their enemies as subhuman, undeserving of the protections afforded by the laws of war. The winter of 1944 to 1945 was one of the coldest on record in Europe, and the extreme weather added another layer of suffering to an already horrible situation. Wounded soldiers and civilians who might have survived with proper treatment died from exposure. Bodies froze solid within hours of death, becoming grotesque monuments to the violence that had claimed them. The cold preserved crime scenes in horrific detail, allowing investigators to document evidence that might otherwise have been lost. The aftermath of the battle saw a massive effort to locate and identify the victims of the massacres. American graves registration units worked alongside Belgian authorities to recover bodies and determine causes of death. In many cases, identification was difficult or impossible. Some victims were buried in unmarked graves, their names lost forever. Others were so badly burned or decomposed that even determining their nationality was challenging. The impact on the local Belgian population was devastating and long-lasting. Entire families had been wiped out, leaving orphans to be raised by relatives or neighbors. The economic destruction was severe, with many villages needing years to rebuild, but perhaps the deepest wounds were psychological. Communities that had existed for centuries were traumatized by the violence they had witnessed. Their sense of security and normalcy shattered beyond repair. The trials that followed the war brought some measure of justice, but they also revealed the challenges of prosecuting war crimes. Many perpetrators escaped justice by fleeing to other countries or assuming false identities. Others received relatively light sentences that seemed inadequate given the gravity of their crimes. The families of victims often felt that the legal proceedings, bound by rules of evidence and procedure, could never truly capture the horror of what had happened or provide adequate punishment for those responsible. The documentary evidence gathered during the investigation of the Christmas massacres fills thousands of pages in archives across the United States and Europe. Photographs show bodies lying in snow-covered fields, buildings reduced to rubble with civilians killed inside, and the faces of survivors marked by trauma and loss. Maps detail the locations of each known massacre, creating a geography of terror across the Ardennes. Witness statements, some barely literate, others eloquently detailed, provide personal accounts of horror that statistics alone cannot convey. The Malmedy Massacre, in particular, entered American military culture as a cautionary tale and a rallying cry. It was taught at military academies, as an example of what happens when armed forces abandon professional standards. Veterans of the Battle of the Bulge would often cite Malmedy when explaining the intensity of their hatred for the SS and their determination to defeat Nazi Germany. The massacre became part of the institutional memory of the United States Army, a reminder of why the laws of war matter and what happens when they're abandoned. The Christmas of 1944 in the Ardennes thus became a defining moment in the moral history of World War II. It demonstrated with terrible clarity the consequences of Hitler's vision of total war, where traditional constraints on violence were dismissed as weakness. It showed how quickly civilized norms could collapse when a regime embraced terror as policy. And it provided heroes and martyrs, whose sacrifice and suffering would be remembered long after the guns fell silent. Today, monuments and memorials across the Ardennes mark the sites of these massacres. Every December, ceremonies are held to remember the victims, and honor the survivors. Elderly veterans, their numbers dwindling with each passing year, return to lay wreaths and share their memories with younger generations. Belgian school children learn about what happened in their villages and towns, ensuring that the memory of the Christmas massacres is not forgotten. The lessons of that terrible Christmas remain relevant today. They remind us that the laws of war, however imperfect, represent humanity's attempt to maintain some vestige of civilization, even in the midst of organized violence. They warn us about the dangers of dehumanizing enemies and abandoning moral constraints in the pursuit of military objectives. They show us that individual choices matter, that each soldier's decision to follow or refuse illegal orders can mean the difference between life and death for innocent people. The story of the Christmas massacres during the Battle of the Bulge is ultimately a story about choices made under extreme circumstances. It is about American soldiers who chose to maintain their humanity even while surrounded and facing death in Bastogne. It is about Belgian civilians who risked everything to help those in need. It is about SS troops who chose to follow orders they knew were wrong, who pulled triggers knowing they were committing murder. And it is about survivors who chose to bear witness, to ensure that the truth of what happened would not be buried with the victims. As we remember that Christmas of 1944, we must recognize that the capacity for both great evil and great good exists within human societies. The same species that produced the SS murderers of Malmedy also produced the defenders of Bastogne and the Belgian civilians who risked their lives to save others. The difference lay not in their nature as human beings, but in the choices they made and the systems that shaped those choices. The Christmas massacres stand as an eternal warning about what happens when civilized nations abandon civilized conduct, when the laws of war are dismissed as inconvenient obstacles to victory. The final casualty figures from the Battle of the Bulge are staggering. The Americans suffered around 89,000 casualties, including 19,000 killed. The Germans lost approximately 100,000 men, with many more captured. Belgian civilian deaths numbered in the thousands. But beyond these statistics lie individual stories of suffering and loss, each victim a person with hopes and dreams cut short by violence. The Christmas massacres represent only a fraction of the battle's total casualties, but they hold special significance because they were murders, not combat deaths, committed in violation of every principle of civilized warfare. The Battle of the Bulge ended with Germany's last reserves shattered and the path to final victory clear for the Allies. But the memory of what happened during that terrible Christmas would endure long after the Third Reich fell. It would influence how international law developed, how military forces were trained, and how subsequent generations understood the Second World War. The frozen fields of the Ardennes, stained with the blood of innocents, became permanent reminders that victory achieved through atrocity is no victory at all, and that even in war, there are lines that must not be crossed.